So as I said today, we've got a great guest. We've got Michael Zoorob, who represents Brookline for Everyone, a relatively new advocacy organization in town that filled a niche that was, clearly untapped. So I'm not going to tell you about it. Michael's going to tell you about it. Michael, tell us a little bit about Brookline for Everyone, and what's the deal?
Sure thing. Thanks, Tommy. It's a pleasure to be on this show, a pleasure and an honor to join you. I'm a board member of Brookline for Everyone. Like you said, Brookline for Everyone is a grassroots organization of Brookline residents who are interested in creating a community that is affordable to people of all incomes, to creating a Brookline that is, economically and racially diverse and inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and vibrant. And our main focus is housing. We're basically an organization that is interested in promoting the development of housing and associated policies that increase opportunities for people of all incomes to live in Brookline. And we see that as an issue that is vitally important in a variety of ways. It's important economically because people need to live in a community in order to get to their work and not spend a ton of their money on rent every month. It's important environmentally because people, the kinds of dwellings people live in and the extent to which those dwellings are built environmentally and built in a way that promotes sustainable uses, are transit oriented, et cetera, that's an important feature of housing. It's important racially in the sense that, like many institutions, housing policy in the US is very much influenced by legacies of racism, and that manifests itself in part through contemporary residential segregation. And we kind of see housing as one way in which, as a town, we can kind of take concrete steps towards advancing racial equity. And, also just broadly in fostering a community. That if you don't get housing policy right, it's hard to have sort of vibrant, walkable communities. It's hard to have sustainable religious institutions. It's hard to have the kind of, a really nice, vibrant mix of people if you don't get housing policy right. And so we formed in 2019. Our foundation is kind of interesting. It came out of basically a townwide Facebook group. Perhaps some listeners are aware of the Brookline Townwide Discussion Facebook page. It's a place where people post about issues. And a lot of us realized that people would post about new housing developments and often their opposition to them. And, some of us would see the same people saying, actually, maybe it's not the prettiest building in the world, but it's actually really important that we build housing. And it's actually quite a good thing when, a single story commercial building on Harvard Street gets replaced with a larger mixed use building with a mix of market rate and affordable housing. And eventually we realized we could do better than just argue with people on Facebook. And we decided to actually meet up and form an organization. So that's in a nutshell, Brookline for Everyone. I'm sure we'll get into some more specifics.
I will say it's hard to do worse than arguing with everyone on Facebook. That's about the worst thing a person can do, I think. And I try hard to stay away from that sort of thing, but we get sucked in. So you said there was a number of folks who watching this Facebook group and sort of had a similar reaction that, hey, wait a minute, these developments that are building housing, maybe preserving first floor retail, there's something to this. What do you have in common other than this singular idea? And did you all come to it in the same way, or what's the story behind some of the co-founders or the board members?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think we aren't all the same, but there are certain commonalities. I think we all live here and we're happy to live here is one common element, and we're interested in making our communities better. I think we tend to be younger than at least the average people involved in local politics, but that's not entirely true. There are members of our board who've lived in Brookline for decades, who've raised their families in Brookline, and now worry that, I mean, it's really more concrete than a worry that their children can't afford to live here. So some of us are sort of, experiencing a range of the challenges to affordability and the consequences of the lack of housing affordability. There is a significant portion of people involved in our organization who are very active in the Jewish community. I'm not one of those people, but these folks very much need housing that's walkable to community institutions. That's an essential part of that community's survival. And so for these folks, making sure that it's possible to build housing and housing for families is really an important part of their group identity and their community. And so that's one component, I think, of a lot of the interest in our organization. And I think we're also sort of broadly interested in inclusivity, that none of us want to live in a community that is sort of all the same economically and racially and age. And we like, a community that is walkable and vibrant and diverse. And so we're interested in fostering policies to that end.
One thing, a word you said a few times that I know when we talk about housing is a stumbling word, is the word affordable. Some people hear the word affordable, and for them, that means subsidized housing for people of very low income, right? 30% of area median income, 50%, very low income. And when they hear affordable housing, that's what they're thinking. Other people hear affordable housing and they're thinking housing that I could afford, or housing that this particular kind of person can afford. And we as a community, we as a state, we as a free-ish market, we know how to build subsidized housing. We don't necessarily build enough of it, in my view, but we understand conceptually how to do it. And we know how to build luxury mansions, right? We just zone to allow it, and those things sort of arrive. What do we do about the huge range in the middle, which frankly is most of the people who currently live in Brookline? How can we as a society get housing that is lowercase a affordable rather than simply capital A affordable?
Yeah, this is such an important and interesting question. And I'm so happy you raised the distinction between different kinds of affordability. I think we need to recognize that there are multiple kinds of affordability crises that are happening in the Metro Boston region. There's a crisis on the very low income scale where there isn't enough subsidized housing and a lot of people are getting displaced. There's also a crisis of senior housing that a lot of folks are sort of stuck in larger homes and they'd like to live in smaller ones, but they really can't downsize. And there's a crisis of middle income housing that a lot of folks really can't afford housing for families, young families. That's in communities like Brookline or Boston, that it's just very difficult to afford sort of a comfortable apartment for a family, or even for a young adult to find a studio and not live with lots and lots of roommates. So there's multiple crises of affordability and they require somewhat different policy solutions, I think. As far as what you've described, it's often termed the missing middle, this kind of housing that isn't subsidized, but isn't exorbitantly expensive. And it's a complicated issue, and a lot of it is a regional housing shortage, that because there is a regional housing shortage, landlords can charge more and homeowners can sell their houses for more, and that's going to tend to make housing more expensive. And that's going to take a regional solution, with the region building more housing to lower the overall, the shortage. But there are concrete things we can do, even with, as a community in Brookline, to promote the development of middle housing, like you've described it. And that has to do with our zoning. It has to do, for example, with our parking minimums. When you require a 2-bedroom apartment to have 2 parking spots, what you tend to get are a smaller number of larger apartments with more parking. And the more parking that they have, the more expensive they are. And so one concrete thing we can do to reduce, to make housing more lowercase a affordable is to reduce the amount of required parking that goes with every unit. One thing we can do in Brookline, which a warrant article that I was one of the main petitioners for, pushed to do, and that's sort of still ongoing, is eliminate requirements from minimum dwelling sizes besides what the state health code requires. There's state minimums for how small a dwelling can be, but Brookline has a much higher minimum dwelling size of 501 square feet, even though there are literally hundreds of apartments in Brookline that are much larger, or much smaller rather, than 501 square feet. So allowing smaller units can be a component of smaller aid affordability. And also, I think allowing more 2 and 3 family houses, especially where in Brookline housing is limited to large lot single family zones. So most of Brookline is zoned such that the only thing that is allowed to be built is single family. A lot of Brookline is built so that the only thing that's allowed to be built is single family on a very large lot, 20 or even 40,000 square feet, so like an acre. And if that's what you can build, that's what will get built. And to promote, housing that is affordable to more people, although certainly not affordable to people who are very low income, we could relax some of these restrictions, allow, somebody who owns a 4,000 or 6,000 square foot single family home to convert that single family home into a 2-family or a 3-family. And, those halves of the duplex are not going to be cheap, but they're going to be more affordable than the larger single family home. So it's a complicated problem, and in Brookline, we're not going to solve the whole regional housing crisis, but we can take concrete steps with our zoning that makes it feasible to build housing types that are less expensive. And a lot of that involves, relaxing lot size minimums, dwelling size minimums, parking minimums, and allowing conversions to, 2 and 3 family housing.
So I want to clarify a statement you made. Units matter. You said that much or even most of Brookline is zoned single family, and that may be actually true by land area. But of course, if you work backwards into lot count or even residences, right? Most residences in Brookline are actually in multifamily buildings, even though most of the land area in Brookline may be zoned single family. I don't know if that's true or not. And I don't know how you count the golf courses and these other things. So there's this interesting question, sort of depends on the slice you look at, right? I know when I'm talking with colleagues and others from around the state, they mistakenly think that all of Brookline is like South Brookline, even though they drive through North Brookline, right? And I when I ask people in Brookline, I say, what neighborhood has the most number of people living in it? What neighborhood? And they say, maybe Aspinwall, maybe Chestnut Hill. It's Beacon Street. Beacon Street has far more people living on it than any other street in town, by a factor of 10 or more, right? And so you raised some interesting points there. One thing I want to pry at a little bit that I've been thinking about, and I hear people who I tend to agree with on housing get it wrong, in my opinion, is they talk about the cost of housing relative to people's income in a percentage, right? And so if you're spending more than 30% or 50% of your income on housing, you're spending too much, right? And I hear that a lot with no careful regard for the circumstances that the person is living in. So for example, if you live in North Brookline and you don't own a car payments, car insurance, cost of parking, and on, right? And you live a light lifestyle, right? You don't have a lot of stuff. You don't spend a lot of money. It seems like it's actually quite easy to be in a situation where you're spending 50% of your money on housing and you're not hanging on by a thread. You're actually reasonably comfortable. And that's not to say that people should be spending a ton of money on housing sort of because that's the way the invisible hand intended. But it is, in my view, important to point out that one person's expectations of monthly bills and costs might actually be very different than another person's. And the assumptions that particularly people who live in suburbs make about what people spend their money on may actually not line up very well with a person who lives in a studio apartment, right? And so, how do we think about how different shapes of housing allows for different individuals or families to live in town because it defines their costs?
Yeah,
I'm leading a question. I don't even have a question. I'm just talking at you, but talk back at me.
yeah, sure. I'll react to that. I do want to say, of course, you're right. Most people who live in Brookline do not live in single family homes. That's not true at all. But most of Brookline's landmass is zoned single family. So that's an important distinction. And I think it points to the fact that, when people think of Brookline, they think of something like Tom Brady's house. They don't think of Dexter Park, although which is a 400 unit apartment building built in the 1970s close to Boston University. Although a lot more people live in, these large multifamily buildings than live in a 40,000 square foot lot, and then a 6,000 square foot home. So it's a really interesting point. And, but yeah, that when people think of our community, they for whatever reason, the image tends to be the least affordable part of our community, and not where most people actually live. As far as your question about people of different circumstances and income being used as a metric for housing, it's a really interesting point. I mean, certainly using income and the 30% of your monthly income being spent on housing as a metric for cost burden. It's really common. It's what the federal government uses, what HUD uses. It's what state housing agencies use. I think it's an easy thing to measure. And obviously, when you reduce something like affordability to a measurement, there's some loss of information, but it might not capture everything. But it's a useful benchmark. When people are spending more than half of their income on rent per month, that often signifies a problem. It tends to be correlated with residential turnover. You can't often spend that much money on your rent. Certainly, if you have children and you're spending more than 50% of your income on rent, that's probably not a sustainable situation. But for young professionals who don't have a family to take care of, it may be possible to spend half of your income on rent. And certainly people in our community do it. I think it's like 20% of people who rent in Brookline spend more than 50% of their income on rent, which is pretty astonishing. It's a majority of people who rent in Brookline spend more than 30% of their income on rent. So that's, but that can be, one way to spend your 20s if you don't have a car and as you said, you're not spending money on car-related expenses. And, you don't have a lot of stuff. Like you said, you tend to rely on community amenities. Perhaps like in my case, probably in a lot of people's cases who live in North Brookline, in non-COVID times, you spend most of your time at a university, and your university has a gym, your university has an office where you can keep some of your stuff. It has, you kind of have a social life and a lot of food, frankly, that goes through your university. And in those kinds of circumstances, the location is really so valuable that it can kind of offset some of the other costs that you might incur on things like, transportation, like car ownership, which can be quite expensive. But and so that's an important point, but I wouldn't want it to overshadow the fact that, if you're a young family and you're spending more than half of your income on rent, that's really not a stable situation. And there's also, I've talked about rent a lot, but there's also the interesting point that, in the 1980s, it was possible for 2 teachers to buy a house in Brookline. And often that's still possible if people have intergenerational wealth, but it's a lot more difficult. And for middle income folks to own in Brookline, and for many people, owning is, it's part of the American dream, for better or for worse. And that causes a lot of turnover, I think, because people move further out when they have children, and they feel like they shouldn't rent their whole lives.
Yeah, and again, there's some values tension there. If you want to have a single family house and you want to be a grass farmer, right? You want to have a lawn to mow. if you're a civil servant, you probably can't afford to do that in Brookline. If you're comfortable with a 3-bedroom condominium, 2 teachers actually probably can make that work. I'm not saying, they're going to have, gorgeous high-end finishes. But that's the tension of, what do you value in terms of your residents? But I want to sort of bend a little bit. Your organization's existed for 18 months, half of which are under COVID. So I'm not expecting a 16-page CV, but tell us about some of the things that your organization has already accomplished, either tangible or relationship building and infrastructure based. What has your group done so far?
Yeah. So we've done a few things. I mean, we formally incorporated as a group. We are an actual legally recognized entity. We have dues paying members. People give us money for the purposes of political action. We have a PAC. We endorse people who ran for election in town elections last May. So we obtained, we submitted questions to folks who were running for office, and quite a lot of them responded, and those who responded favorably or in ways that we found consistent with our values, we endorsed them, and we went to bat for those people. We had a lot of those folks because we're now all on Zoom, and this election, the May election, or it was actually in June, wasn't it? The 2020 election was during COVID. Folks, we asked them, we submitted some questions and people kind of interviewed themselves, and we put those on our YouTube channel. So people don't campaign a lot in these local elections, and knowing something about a candidate can be helpful. And it was nice to see that even in the League of Women Voters guide, a lot of folks were touting our endorsements. So, it carried some weight with those people. We've endorsed warrant articles, and we've, people in our organization email their town meeting members and call their town meeting members and lobby for them. So the first time that started happening was November 2019, which was when Brookline adopted a zoning bylaw allowing accessory dwelling units, which are kind of smaller apartments within single family homes. So for example, an in-law apartment or an attic apartment or a granny suite, I think they're sometimes called, but these kind of smaller apartments within single family homes that are kind of accessory to the main house. And also there was a warrant article on commercial parking minimums, which we supported, and it did pass almost unanimously in November 2019. And more recently, we've been, we petitioned for several warrant articles in the most recent town meeting. And one of those on micro units became highly contentious, although in our view, it was really just restoring something that has existed in Brookline for more than a century, which is people living in relatively small apartments, and I happen to live in one. And so, we've also submitted warrant articles like that and seen them through the process. A member of our, another board member spearheaded a warrant article, basically, which was an affirmation of Brookline for everyone's values. It was a resolution that said, there's a regional housing shortage. There's all kinds of legacies of inequality related to housing that in some ways Brookline's history is complicit in. And, we should do something about it. We should do something about it for the environment, for the economy, for our community, for racial equity, and so on. And that, got softened a little bit, but ultimately town meeting did pass something that includes a commitment to building more housing. And so in addition to this kind of, legislative political activism, we've also spent a lot of time trying to get folks to show up at public meetings. A lot of housing in Brookline is not by right. In fact, almost none of it is. All the new housing, almost all, not all, of the new housing that's been built in the last decade or so has been through the state's Chapter 40B law, which has a lot of opportunities for public comment. And we've really been encouraging people to show up and push for for good projects and provide an affirmation that housing matters. So we've been active electorally, legislatively, and also just trying to grow as an organization and build partnerships with other people.
So if folks watching on Brookline Interactive Group are thinking, this is the organization for me, I want some of this. what do? They just send a postcard, self-addressed stamped envelope to Michael Zoorob. How does one get involved with Brookline for Everyone?
Yeah, they just send me a check. No, of course not. We have a website, brooklineforeveryone.com. I think a really good place to get started is to go to that website and read what's on it. It includes not only just sort of general statements about what we support, but also more specifically what legislation we've petitioned, what in Brookline, what legislation in Brookline, we've supported that we haven't petitioned. And it provides an opportunity to join a mailing list. And that's where, you get regular email updates about our meetings. We're having a meeting later this month with some of the folks who are interested in turning Brookline into a city. I think they're called a Better Brookline. Just to hear what they have to say. They tend to be a younger group. And so we're sort of interested in their perspective. And we don't have a position on that issue, but we're interested in, what they think about how it interfaces with housing. A few months ago, we had Jake Auchincloss come on, who's now a member of Congress for our district, and talk about housing and his priorities. So we have meetings like that, and also just kind of regular updates through email that tell people how they can get involved, what meetings they can show up to, what community events might be relevant, academics or otherwise who are speaking on housing related issues, and public meetings. So yeah, go to our website, check us out, and sign up.
Michael, thanks for joining me today here on Brookline Interactive Group. It's always great to see you, if only virtually. But you've been a wonderful guest. Brookline for Everyone, folks. Check it out. See if they're selling what you're buying, and if they are, it's an opportunity to be involved in our community, advocating for changing the world in a way you want it changed. And I think that's something we should be thinking about doing more of in 2021, regardless of where you think we ought to go. So again, Michael Zoorob, Brookline for Everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Another great guest, another great episode, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you,
Bye,
Tommy.
everyone.
My pleasure, Tommy. Thank you.